Good morning. Welcome to the November 27th Eugene Planning Commission meeting. My name's John Borowski. I'm the chair. I am going to have to leave a little early today, so I'm going to arrange the schedule a little bit. I'm going to rearrange the agenda just a little bit and go to public comment first, as always, and then I'm going to go to items from commission and staff, and then we'll go into our presentations, if that's all right with everybody. Is there anybody in the audience that would like to speak today? If so, step on up. Seeing none, I'll move on to items from commission and staff. Any, Commissioner Baker?
Yes, I attended the Sustainability Commission meeting. It was held on November 15th, and I just wanted to mention a few things that were discussed in case people are interested to go back and review their minutes, which weren't, were taken. They wouldn't be available till about now. Staff, Terry Hardy made a very nice presentation on Eugene, sort of an overview of the process and what's going on and what will be going on in the future. And then the primary things that they talked about were the climate committee talking about the climate ordinance that the city council was considering adopting. And then there were staff updates, and then there were committee reports. There's one thing that keeps coming up at the meeting, that I mentioned this because I think the planning department could help assist them. There's a very active committee that's looking at tiny houses, what we call that. And there's some concern that they are limited because of some of the rules about SDUs. And these questions come up several times. I think if someone from staff could review the R1 lots and give them a number that, so many percent would be excluded by the requirements for the size of the lot, that would be very helpful, because if it's a large number, then it makes sense for them to focus on that. But if it's a very small number, then it's not so much of an issue.
Who's the chair of that committee?
The chair of that committee, I think, is Sue
Walling?
Yeah,
Okay.
I believe she's the chair of the committee. And I also told them that I would provide some information. There was some, I mentioned the issue, which they weren't aware of, that some property has some restrictions based upon when it was subdivided. There were some restrictions placed on the lot, which could include building size, materials for the exterior and so forth. And those kind of conditions could limit the ability to do SDUs. And the city doesn't, I don't think the city has a list of all the properties that might have any of those restrictions on them.
Are you talking about like CC&Rs?
Yeah. Okay. And I just don't know. I didn't know at the time. I didn't think the city had any idea of what percent of the properties, say in an R1 zone, that had CCRs. Not that they would know what the details were, but that just even that it exists means that there's things could be restricted.
So just to not have the conversation right now, should we follow up with Sue, or
I think it would be
the
useful to
best person
follow up with Sue, and
Okay.
she would certainly feed it to the committee.
Okay, perfect.
And those are the two questions that came up most. I mean, there's some concerns about when we put in code changes for SDUs, we put in some slope setbacks and some height and size limitations in parking. There's some concerns about that, but I think the largest concern was that some of our basic restriction on lot size would limit the ability to add a tiny house to a property, to a lot. And of course, CCRs could limit it in other areas. There were a couple of other staff reports, but those are the primary areas they've been working on. I'll mention one other area that didn't come up this time, but it's been discussed in detail in previous ones, and that is looking at where the city has contracts with, say, banks and so forth, and because of some activities that the bank may have done, for example, funding some of the Dakota pipeline projects that are in controversial areas. There's been a proposal from the Sustainability Commission to divest from certain, for example, banks that handle the city's operations because of their activity in providing loans for some of those activities. So that's the report from the Sustainability Commission, and they will be meeting. They don't meet in December, but they will be meeting in January. I think it's the second or the third. I think it's the third Wednesday. Look it up.
All right, we'll move on while you look at the date.
17th.
Commissioner Nicolello.
So there was a great Register Guard article on it today, but there is a Vision Zero roadmap that's out for comment right now. It's continuing. Well, that's not a word. Continuating. Happy Monday. It's a continuation of some of the work that we did with the transportation system plans. So definitely provide comments if you find anything in there worth commenting on. And the staff member who's in charge of that with Public Works is Larissa, and her contact information is located on the page, and I can send it out if you guys want. There's also a link included in it on the Register Guard online version. So definitely provide comments if you have them.
Commissioner Taylor.
I just thank you, Commissioner Baker. I actually have been meaning to bring this up for some time. I've gotten comments from public as well as following Sustainability Commission, and just the momentum, both from a staff perspective as well as AIA, U of O, just in missing mental housing. I'm not sure where it fits, but I would love to actually get an update on SDUs, lot sizes, so that we can actually accommodate this this momentum, because I think it will help with density, obviously, and consistent with statewide planning goals. And I think some of our code sections aren't necessarily really encouraging that. So, thanks.
I put myself in the queue. Well, go ahead, Commissioner Randall.
I was just going to kind of to tag on to that, just kind of where we're at as a city on Senate Bill 1051, how it relates to all of that as well.
Okay.
Thank you.
So I did a little bit of research and on the role of the Planning Commission, and if we go into our code and our organizational bylaws, under purpose and objective, it is under C is to cooperate. Oh, there you go, Monday again. To cooperate with private developers and public agencies in their effort to provide an adequate supply of housing for low-income families. That's our C. And then there's another one, to make suggestions to the City Council and other public authorities concerning laying out of widening of roads and streets and parking lots. And then in the actual city code, there is a call for the Planning Commission to submit an annual report to the City Council. And I'm thinking that it might be an opportunity for us in the month or two ahead to maybe sit down and look at some of the things that are coming before council. I went to their tentative working agenda. There's a lot of things that touch this committee that we're not really, I think we could get out ahead of. On the 13th of December, the Housing Policy Board is going to be presenting about a construction excise tax, which will go to fund low-income housing, which is directly in our wheelhouse. There are approved polls on the schedule for missing middle housing, for C2 zoning, rest stop sightings, and then also follow-up workups on unimproved roads and commercial setbacks. So these are all things that are going to be coming before the city council in the coming months. And I think maybe using the annual report might be a way for us to get in front of them and say, hey, we have an opportunity to help you with some of these things and dig a little bit deeper. I don't know the appropriate way or time to do that, but I know that our schedule in December is open. We don't have anything going in December. That may be too quick of a term for staff. We do have 2 meetings scheduled in January, but maybe we could throw another one in there. I'm just putting some things out there. There's a lot of things coming forward that are right in our wheelhouse, and I would really like to get in front of those.
Commissioner Broski, would it maybe be wise for us to try and set up a meeting with Mayor Bennis and the council president just to kind of address, because it feels like these other commissions are having conversations and council's having conversations, and just to kind of maybe make sure we're all on the same page.
Right.
And that might be good to have that kind of as a pre-conversation first. So
Yeah.
if you want to.
I mean, like I said, I'm just throwing it out there. I don't know the mechanism to get it done. We've talked, blue in the face, and I know staff has really done a lot to try and get us more liaison time with the council. I think that the city code that says we have to do an annual report to them, which we haven't done in a few years, might be our shoehorn to get in there and say, hey, it's in the code, we're supposed to do this, and that might be our way to do it. It's just an idea that I'm throwing out. We have had fairly loose workloads. Not that staff hasn't.
Yeah.
Staff is working hard on a lot of things. It might be something where we just come together as ourselves and do some research and look at it. But I just wanted to put that out.
Thank you, Commissioner Borowski, for bringing that to our attention. And I just wanted to bring this up because you have to leave a little earlier. Do you want to flip urban reserves for assignment for committees so you can be part of the discussion?
I'm fine with the committees.
Okay.
Wherever you want to throw me is fine.
Okay.
But no, I'm fine. I'll do it. Commissioner Baker.
I just wanted to follow up on Commissioner Nicolau. There was a very interesting article in the New York Times recently about desperate, million miles drive. In other words, and it was interesting because it showed originally, it compares some period back in time and currently. And back in time, the U.S. was sort of comparable with, in fact, it had lower death rates on the highways than a lot of other countries. And now it's reversed, and the U.S. has there are a number of countries, including Slovenia, but Australia, Canada, a number of European countries that have about less than half the mortality rates per billion miles traveled than the U.S. does right now. So, what Commissioner Nicolau mentioned is an important issue to consider, and that article might give you some interesting perspective on it.
Thank you.
All right. Anything from staff?
Yeah, first of all, thanks for the heads up about some of the items that you all brought up just now. I think we've been having some conversations about some kind of a planning newsletter or something along those lines, and I really like the idea of some kind of an annual report or some kind of a vehicle to talk about all the good work that we've been doing and all the good work that we are going to need to be doing. So I like that idea. I think I'm going to be working with folks in the CMO to see if we can get that joint council planning commission meeting scheduled sometime after the first of the year. I think part of it was they just had a really packed agenda up through the last part of this year. So, and having some kind of a conversation leading up to that, just to get on the same page, I think is a really good idea. So more to come on that one. Did want to share that on December 5th, which is next week, right? And this is Tuesday, right? We have the LUBA hearing for the the urban growth boundary housing component, of course, which was appealed by the HBA. And several of us are going to be up there attending that and watching. And of course, Emily Jerome will be there presenting our case. And so that's pretty exciting. I'll let you know how that goes as soon as we have any more information about where that's headed.
Great.
I think that's about it, unless anybody else has anything else to add.
All right.
Okay.
Thank you. Commissioner Baker.
I was just going to ask Planning Director Kostic whether you knew whether those were recorded or just minutes later on generated.
Yeah, the LUBA meeting, I don't know.
The hearings are recorded. I don't know how you can access them. They record them. They must be available on their public records. They're not available online. Obviously, I have the parties' briefs and the brief that we filed in response that you're certainly welcome to read if you're interested in those. The hearings themselves each party is limited to 30 minutes, and they're largely just to address issues that the board may want more information on from the briefs. It's not a complete start to finish, cover of the action. So they may not be as interesting as you might think. But you could, I'm sure, get it if you contacted LUBA.
All right.
One more thing, I forgot to mention that there is a historic review board meeting tomorrow at 8:30 in the same room.
Okay.
It's talking about some small grants that they're going to apply for historic preservation.
Okay. We will move on to item number 2, which is a work session on urban reserves. Terry?
Great, thank you. So we're very happy to be talking with you about urban reserves because it's an opportunity to begin implementing our vision and our urban growth boundary, and in this case, beyond the year 2032. The other major efforts that have been kicked off or are taking up a majority of staff's time are, as you know, the River Road Santa Clara Neighborhood Planning Project and the Growth Monitoring Program. And this is the third biggie as far as work on the long-range planning staff's desks. So today we're going to talk about why we're doing this project, why plan for urban reserves, what is the process, and Emily will have a chance to walk you through the law, and then where we are and what's coming up next. So I'm going to spend a little bit of time on this first question. There's just a picture on the slide, but the heart of the matter is why we're doing this project. And as I tried to lay out in your memo, but I'd like to still talk about for the general public and those watching the meeting, we are planning for a future population growth in Eugene that is uncertain. We are not confident that our projections are going to be right. And if we do end up growing faster than we anticipate, we need to have a plan in place to be able to grow in the best places and in the ways that best align with our community values. So currently, our future urban growth boundary expansions in Eugene would likely be limited by our state laws to exception areas or areas that are already developed to some degree. Places like Bailey Hill Road in the South Hills, or Bloomberg Road in the LCC Russell Creek Basin. And I'll show you maps later on in the presentation. But the problem with that way of growing is that our studies show that most of those lands fall short of meeting our needs. And for example, they may not be affordable due to the high cost of providing public services in these locations, water and sewer, and they may also not offer the best access to neighborhood amenities like commercial services or transit. And this problem is timely and urgent because our city council has directed us to look at our urban growth boundary again within 3 years. And this direction says we should use the most recent population forecast available, which we think is going to show a significantly higher number of people moving to Eugene than the old forecasts do. So if it turns out we have a need to expand in 3 years, and the council directs us to pursue that, we would most likely have no choice but to expand onto the exception lands that I described earlier under the current situation. So for all of these reasons, the council has directed staff to prepare urban reserves for consideration within 2 years of finalization of our UGB. So under that timeline, we will complete the urban reserves identification process before we have our first growth monitoring report, and that lets us preserve or have more options for where the city would grow in the future. Another important reason to plan for urban reserves is that we are concerned about land speculation. Without the urban reserves in place, rural property owners outside the Eugene UGB don't know whether or not their property may become an option for future expansion. Our state planning goals say that we should support farm and forest uses. However, some owners are unsure if they should continue investing in those uses if they're likely or eligible to be urbanized in the future. Or the price of land outside the UGB may go up if investors buy the land hoping that it will become available for urbanization. So through this process, urban reserves can help the landowners around Eugene plan for the future by clarifying which properties will be reserved for possible urban use and which ones will not. Also, the local government agencies such as Eugene, Lane County, and the service providers like special water and fire districts are faced with uncertainty if we don't know where we're going to be growing in the future. Once the reserves are established, our communities will be better able to plan for the costs, service agreements between agencies, and coordination needed to serve our future neighborhoods with public facilities and services. And I do want to stress that our collaboration with Lane County is absolutely critical to making this project a success. And county staff is here today. Lydia and Lindsay are on the county's team helping support the Urban Reserves project, which is a joint effort. So that's the why, or at least an overview of the why. And continuing in the same vein, to really do a good job with our planning projects, we need our work to be guided by all that's embodied in the vision. Our vision expresses the values we care about protecting while we grow. And these include access to farmland, parks and open spaces, and walkable, beautiful neighborhoods where we can easily travel from place to place, housing options that are affordable to every income level, and access to job opportunities. We also care about being good stewards of our natural resources and limiting the impacts of climate change on our people as well as the place. Our community vision is summarized by this map showing the key transit corridors, transportation corridors, and our downtown, surrounded by 20-minute neighborhoods, and the 7 pillars, which serve as underpinnings for all the planning work that we do. So an outcome of urban reserves is that we'll be able to consider the full range of desired outcomes in our future community, such as building new 20-minute neighborhoods with a mix of housing types affordable to all incomes, and future neighborhoods that can be located and designed so that transportation facilities and public utilities are provided in a cost-effective manner that, again, aligns with those 7 pillars. An important community benefit of urban reserves is assurance that the values that guided Envision Eugene from the beginning will be carried forward as we plan for our Eugene beyond 2032. So all community members can access the housing, jobs, commercial services, schools, and parks that they need into the future. That was Urban Reserves 101. Why are we doing it? And the rest of the presentation gets into a little bit more detail about the process, and then I'll kind of come back after Emily goes through that piece and let you know where we are. A clarifying question at this point?
Well, I had a question about the map of, just a minor question about the map that shows the land types
Yeah, it comes up later in the presentation.
Comes up
Okay.
in the presentation.
Yeah. So now for the legal overview.
So Terry asked me if I would talk to you about the legal framework for this process. And you are fortunate enough to have it kind of fresh in your mind from the UGB process. It's very similar in many ways. So hopefully if I'm saying anything you don't understand, stop me, but I think you'll follow along fine. Big picture is, urban reserve land is land that you've pre-identified, so for inclusion within the UGB. We didn't have any of that for your last UGB process. This is land that it stays outside the UGB, but is sort of marked for future expansion. So I want to talk a little bit about how that land is identified and what it means from kind of a legal perspective. There are very, very few state statutes that govern urban reserves. They're in Chapter 195. Most of what we will be addressing in terms of law are DLCD rules, which are located in their Division 21, so OAR 660-21. And one very, very big difference between the urban reserve process and the UGB process is, as Terry said, it's an extremely cooperative process. The city can't do it alone, and neither can the county. It has to be done together. And largely, in the end of the process, what we'll have are a series of intergovernmental agreements that are signed after we go through this process of identifying and agreeing on what the urban reserve land is. So that will involve Eugene primarily staffing the matter and taking lead because we're the ones that are promoting the idea. Lane County will be involved probably more so along the way than in the UGB process. Special districts as well, anybody that serves the areas that we're looking at or that might serve in the future. So these are the special districts that do water, fire, those kinds of services outside the UGB right now. Also, any city that is within 2 miles of our current UGB must be involved. And then other affected local governments. And so for us, that probably means EWEB, MWMC, which is our wastewater provider, potentially ODOT. So how do you make these go? Down button?
Yeah.
Steve, I'm going to have,
I just had a quick question about this. So cities within 2 miles, is that aside from Springfield, does that include any others?
I think it's probably
Coburg.
Junction City.
And Coburg.
And Coburg.
Within 2 miles?
Yeah, I mean, you guys would know better than me, but yes. And that's largely because, in some parts of the state, you may have 2 jurisdictions looking at this process at the same time. They need to accommodate their own growth as well, so we need to coordinate to make sure we're not stepping on one another's toes. So just like in the UGB, one of the most important things that we need to figure out is what our estimate of our land needs are. So this might be for housing, employment, parks, and schools. Obviously, I think most pressing in our area right now is housing, but urban reserves are not, they're not specific to any one type of land need. So we'll, I think, be surveying all the land needs. And the planning horizon is flexible. It could be an entire 30 years beyond the horizon for our own UGB. So that could be, our UGB is until 2012. We could look all the way out to our population's needs through 2062. Or you can do as little as 10 additional years to your UGB. So it could be as little as a planning horizon that ends in 2042. We have to specify what that date is, but we don't have to specify what that date is until the end. And so it may be that when we identify the lands that we want, you guys choose to plan for a little bit less because you don't want to take such a big bite or to identify so much land. So it's an iterative process. You don't have to declare your need in the beginning. You can do your study and then figure out how much you want to accommodate. The population growth figures, during our UGB process, there was new state law that says PSU is going to adopt population growth figures and we have to use them, which is quite a relief to us. I think the biggest issue around population is going to be when we're ready to commit to the population forecast, because we get them every 3 years. Are they on a 3-year cycle or 5?
3 or 4.
So we'll have to decide when we have the population numbers that we're going to use, and then base our studies and analysis on those numbers. So that all goes into how much land do we need and what kind of land would that be. Then we need to identify the candidate urban reserve land. So land that could possibly be in our urban reserves is land that has to be within a quarter mile of our current UGB. It can't be severely constrained by natural hazards or natural resource protections. Not occupied by structures or roads. And there's some flexibility on that, like if there's a large portion of a site that has some development on it, we can consider that. And then the rules use the term suitable to meet our land needs. And as you might recall, when we did our urban growth boundary, that term suitable is not well defined by the state law or by cases, and so we'll work our way through what that means. But in other words, you don't have to identify land that clearly doesn't meet any of your identified needs. So there'll be some discussions around that. But when we've identified land that meets those priority or those factors, I call that our candidate land. So that's the land that could potentially be identified as urban reserve. Then the work goes into prioritizing that candidate land to determine what it is we mark for urban reserves. So these are the same priorities that we use for identifying urban growth boundary land. The first priority is, and this is where Commissioner Baker, you probably want to look at that map, the county exception land and non-resource land is the first land that we have to bring into first land we identify for urban reserves. Then if all that land isn't enough to meet the city's needs, then you look to county's marginal lands. And finally, you look to agricultural land or forest land, and within that category, we identify the least productive land first to bring in. So that the very last thing we would identify for urban reserve land is high-value farmland or very productive forest land. But when you're considering the kind of need that we'll probably have, and when you're considering the nature of the land that surrounds us, I can't imagine that you won't get to some difficult choices about high value and productive farm and forest land. Now, there's some exceptions to the priority scheme. They're the same ones that apply to the urban growth boundary. Those may be up for some discussion later in the process. They largely have to do with the ability to get services to particular areas, and then also some considerations for efficient urban growth. But for the most part, those priorities will follow the map, and when Terry gets to that, we can point that out a little more clearly. If you get to a point where you've identified enough land to meet the city's needs and there's some additional extra land within that priority category, the state provides some consideration factors for which land do you pick within that priority level. So if you get to the point where you're into ag and forest land and you don't need all of it, you pick between it based on these 4 factors, which are from statewide planning goal 14, same ones we used in urban growth boundary, so they're efficient accommodation of our identified needs. So that's where we might consider transportation issues and service provision, orderly and economic provision of public facilities and services, comparative environmental, energy, economic, and social consequences. So that one requires some balancing of these 5 factors, or 4. And then compatibility of what we're proposing to eventually do on this land as an urban use with surrounding farm and forest lands, also a consideration. So if we're looking at trying to decide between 2 areas, one of which is surrounded by productive agricultural land and one of them is surrounded by other land, we would favor the latter. So once that process is complete, and that will need to be written out in a study and with findings and analysis, just like with the urban growth boundary. That study will need to be adopted, so that's obviously something that would come before the Planning Commission. And then the Planning Commission's other job is to make a recommendation to the council on literally identifying it on maps. So it has to be shown on our zoning maps. It has to be shown on our comprehensive plan maps. Beyond that, it's the county that does that adopts plan policies and regulations for that land, which makes sense because if you think of where your jurisdiction ends, it's at the city limits and in some ways at the urban growth boundary. Certainly when we're getting out past that, that's county jurisdiction. So we can make recommendations and help them along with regulations that will work for them and working with the affected residents to the extent that they want staff involvement on that. But in the end, plan policies and code provisions to make sure that land is preserved for eventual urban use is a county obligation if they want to support the urban reserves. And essentially, they just need to make sure that they're not allowing things on the land that's been identified for urban reserve that would make it between the time it's designated and the time it's needed unusable. So it can't be divided up into real small parcels. And there are some protections for those landowners as well. It has to be continued to be planned and zoned for rural uses. And to the extent they could put a house on it before this happens, they can still put a house on it after. So the rules do strike somewhat of a balance. But it, as Terry said, provides some certainty for those landowners. I mean, their property values will probably go up pretty quickly if they're identified as an urban reserve. And those who are not urban reserve will know that they should continue to commit to their rural uses that they have on their land. Finally, this whole thing sort of gets completed through intergovernmental agreements with all those parties that I talked about. Any of the entities that may provide services to this land has to be involved, and there's a transition agreement about how everything will take place in terms of that urbanization process when it finally does happen. Those IGAs, intergovernmental agreements, are largely done through city manager, county administrator signature. And generally what we do is we ask the council to review the draft agreement, and make a recommendation to the manager whether the manager should sign it with revisions, not sign it. And your involvement in the IGA process, I'm not sure how that, you certainly don't legally need to be involved in that, but probably the policies that surround it will be of interest to you, so it'll be up to staff to decide how to present or provide you with that information. So, the main reason for going through all this, as Terry said, is that it should simplify and streamline things for when the city does need to expand its UGB again. And the key piece of that is that going forward, the urban growth boundary expansion laws, which have changed since you did your urban growth boundary, they make the first priority for expansion exception land and urban reserve land. So that any land that you identify for urban reserves, regardless of what color it is on that map, it becomes a new color, urban reserves. And it is among the first priority of land that you can go on to. The idea being, if you know you're going to grow in there in the next 50 years, it's okay for you to go there first. Which allows the county and the city to make decisions that are a lot more potentially supported by the affected property owners or the builders who may utilize the land, instead of being forced to go into these exception areas that really don't provide those opportunities. Any questions about the legal end of things?
Commissioner Taylor, and I've got myself in the queue.
Emily, can you? I would assume it's similar to the UGB expansion. it has to be contiguous. So as we're identifying properties, is it a similar process as UGB? If you find, your priority properties, but then there are a few that are not, that make it contiguous, and there's a process of evaluating that contiguous the contiguous properties relative to the value of the larger area that you're trying to bring in.
The urban reserve laws around that concept are exactly the same as the UGB laws that you applied.
Perfect.
The UGB laws have changed, but the urban reserve laws haven't. So they harken back to exactly what you're used to.
Okay.
And one of the exceptions is potentially to provide services and essentially to get to what might be a really good exception area, but you may have to, run a line or a road through some farmland. So that there's some potential for accommodating that kind of thing.
Perfect, thank you.
Okay, put myself in the queue. I had a couple questions, and it goes to policy decisions and who are the decision makers. You put a couple of things out there that, to me, in my view, were policy decisions, kind of like when the council decided on housing mix or whatever. And the one was the timeline, 40 to 60 years. Is that, and then the other one was, which population estimate are we going to use? Is it going to be 2015, or are we going to wait till 2018 or whatever? So with it being a multi-jurisdictional thing and the county being basically the driver, who is the decision maker on those policy issues?
Well, ultimately, I think just as the county had to be, they had to act on the UGB just like the city did. So in essence, they had to agree with all those underlying policy considerations. They tend to feel like those decisions, from what we think we heard from them, are of local concern. And the majority of them feel like they will defer to the local government's determination. But there are a lot of those policy decisions to make, and one of the initial questions is whether we, obviously the simplest thing, whether it's the right or most accurate thing, would be to just, we made those decisions 3 years ago, let's go with all the same assumptions and carry those forward and see where that, where that takes us. But they may, our council may want to relook at mix and relook at the myriad of things. I just don't know. It is certainly, I think, first going to be a question for Eugene to propose something to the county, and then staff can figure out how they want to, and at what point they want to make sure that the other parties involved are comfortable with those assumptions that sort of everything built on.
Well, and the reason I'm saying that is because in the past, when we did our UGB, there were hurdles, and then it came back to, council made a decision, gave you direction, and then council came back. And so I'm just wondering, are you going to take this to council early with these decision points and get a firm, do you want to go 40 years? Do you want to go 60 years? Do you want to use 2015? Do you want to use 2017? Bringing that on early so that the work that we may do and you may do as staff, when it comes back to them, they've already got that hard thing. And have you identified those policies that will need those decision points?
Those will be project manager decisions.
I think you've just hit on two of them.
Okay.
But yeah, I would agree with what Emily said, and some of the issues we'll get right into come project launch, which I'm going to talk about in just a second.
Okay. Commissioner Baker.
Yeah. I have some similar questions that were raised by the two other commissioners too. One is the quarter mile within the existing UGB. I assume that just means the edge of this property that you're bringing in has to be within a quarter mile, not the property, it's the total property, or is that still unclear by the wording?
Let me double check what it specifically says. Give me a minute to find that provision, but I'm.
Well, and I had another question
Yeah.
for.
Okay. If it has to do with the map, I'm almost there.
No.
No?
It's not about the maps. It was about this issue about like housing mix and so forth. we have a commitment to get a monitoring plan in place and get the first report out in a certain period of time. I don't remember the exact timing, but I'm wondering if that would be available to help facilitate some of these reconsiderations if they were, because I just don't, on the top of my head, I just don't remember when the monitoring plan is.
It's actually 3 years, whereas urban reserves are due for consideration in 2 years.
So the first report, I thought we're going to get an interim report at some period of time before that.
No, we're busy building the system as we speak.
And Commissioner Baker, the definition of nearby land, which is where that comes from, is land that lies wholly or partially within a quarter mile of an urban growth boundary.
So the edge.
Yep.
Commissioner Nicolello.
So just a few things. The first one is jumping off of Commissioner Baker's question. Is there any chance that information in that growth monitoring report would impact urban reserves findings, or is that, I've never seen one of these reports, so I don't know what's in it.
Right. So I think there will be an iterative nature to all of this work. We're building the system, as I just mentioned, right now. We will have probably early findings from it, but the basic structure of the timeline, and I think this was very intentional in how council directed us back in 2015, is to identify the urban reserves first, so that when we have the report that tells us about the need, we're prepared to act on that. But that doesn't mean that we can't use whatever information has come in and have that inform our analysis.
Okay. And then that makes a lot of sense. And then as a second question, and this one, SB 1051, we keep bringing it up. No one really knows. I think I've been a part of how many email listservs where like 18 different planners have 18 different ideas on what it is. So it'll be an exciting legal issues workshop on Friday for OAPA. But this is difficult because we don't have a legally clear definition of suitable. So for example, there's land proposed here that would be in the South Hills, but as we've seen with a major component of the UGB appeal from the home builders, and I will say that this part does have merit, it is difficult and expensive to build there, and there is a limited density because of the South Hills area plan. And, you know, that's how that area has been developed, that's the refinement plan in place, that's the reality of that area. And so is there, and it's not under clear and objective standards. So my question is, how does SB 1051 impact the urban reserve planning? And two, as part of that suitability, how does limited density, expense, and things like that play into that definition as well?
In the case law that has come out of the term as it's used for UGB,
The suitability term?
yeah,
Uh-huh.
it wouldn't encapsulate those kind of considerations. I think, though, those do come into play in terms of the density that you assign to that land. So, you know, we shouldn't overcount its capacity to meet our particular needs, or its ability to be divided into lots that are small enough to meet the city's needs. The other thing is, you know, more imminent on your to-do list, or at least as imminent, is a relook at the needed housing provisions. And, you know, depending on how you approach that and the results that come out of the city council's review of that, it may change how that area develops. It may be that there's more capacity inside the UGB as a result of those changes, or it may not. But yeah, there are just a lot of factors, all of which I think are important to bring up so we can figure out if they're important enough, there's got to be a place to consider them. Whether it's under suitability or some other way, I think that, you know, we have to try to let common sense prevail. And so, like I said, it may not be under suitability, but I think somewhere.
And if I remember correctly, the clear and objectives, I don't think ADUs have to be figured out by individual entities until July of 2018, but the clear and objective part is effective immediately, right?
Well, we, for some time, have treated all residential development as needed housing that has to have a clear and objective path for approval.
Right.
So I don't know that that piece really changes much for the city. But, you know, the conversations on that are certainly going to continue.
Thank you.
Okay.
Just a couple things to add, if I might. I think one of the questions that came up was around population forecasts, and I believe in Council's direction around this issue, they already have stated that we would be using the population forecast, the latest PSU population forecast in place at the time we established the urban reserve. So just wanted to point out that that piece of direction has already been embedded. Regarding the other assumptions and variables, because as Terry mentioned, we're still working on and going to be working on putting together the systems in the database to be able to collect and effectively report on a whole variety of different factors that have to do with land use and other kind of related issues. We don't anticipate that to be fully operational and ready and have that report completed until probably after we've made it through the urban reserves process. I think the important thing to keep in mind as we think about urban reserves is because we're looking at 10 to 30 years beyond the 20-year UGB. If you look at the most recent PSU population forecast from 2015, that ends up being about an additional 50,000 people beyond what we're considering already today within our 20-year urban growth boundary. That's a lot of people. And so when you're looking at lands, you know, you can talk about density here, whatever factors there. I think the decision about whether we look at 10 years or whether we look at 30 years is going to have a much larger influence on how many lands we consider for the urban reserves than any of those other factors would. So in saying that, what I mean is we could spend a heck of a lot of time trying to do complicated analyses and backcasting for the assumptions that we worked on through Envision Eugene. And that, if you'll recall, was by far the most time-consuming part of that process. If we're going to be complete with the urban reserves process within 2 years, it doesn't seem realistic to me that we would be able to do that, given that we're not going to have our growth monitoring system in place to be able to guide us. So just something to consider, that when we move forward into the urban reserves process, we'll also be considering, and I think it'll be a good question to answer up front, which assumptions we're going to be using as we move forward.
Thanks. And just commenting on what you said,
Yep.
you said that the population forecast, the council already decided using the most current. Well, if you use that language and most current, and 2018 they come out with a new one, that's going to be the most current. So
That's correct.
Getting that, you know, you don't want to do a year's worth of work on 2015 and then 2018, you know.
That's right. That's one of the variables we're going to have to think about as we move forward.
Commissioner Baker.
Yeah, I was going to suggest, given that you're just developing the plan for this, that one way to think about this is the way that the International Climate Body does projections. They do a high, low, and medium, you know, at least preliminarily, and then you adopt one of those scenarios, which might be the, you know, whichever one makes the most sense at the time. But at least that way you get an impact of saying changing housing mix or lot size, or you know, some grouping of variables that you have, you know, that would affect that. That's one way, it seems to me, that to handle those sort of variables that might change very soon once you get a monitoring report out. Mm-hmm. So that way you at least be ahead of the curve.
Mm-hmm. Okay, moving on. Terry, do you want to?
Okay. This part's pretty short, but thanks for all those really good questions. Where are we? This might seem like yesterday, but as you will recall, our urban growth boundary was just adopted by our City Council in July and the Board of County Commissioners in August. It's pending acknowledgement from the state. And while the new UGB did not include an addition for housing land, we have gathered a lot of information about land all around the UGB when we were expecting to do a small expansion a few years ago. So we've gathered a lot of info, and one map that you saw a lot as Sarah Allison and the rest of the team presented to you the analysis of expansion for industrial, was this map. This is our study area. It was actually a half mile, so that gray area is a half mile outside of the urban growth boundary and also includes everything within the metro plan boundary. So that was, we went through a process of determining what the study area would be, documented it on this map and used it for that study. We'll need to do a similar thing for the urban reserve study area. Then the most interesting map, I think, of the day is this one that shows within that study area the priority categories of land. So Emily already said this, but I think it bears repeating. Since Eugene doesn't currently have urban reserves, there's no priority 1 land shown on this map. But so it skips to priority 2, and those are the darker rust-colored areas on this map around Eugene. And those are the exception lands. They include such things as the airport, Lane Community College, rural areas made up of 5-acre lots or sometimes smaller, as examples, and they're located all around the UGB. The priority 3 lands, which are more of the bright orange, are marginal lands, and there are a few of those. They are identified as having marginal farm or forest capabilities. And then lastly, the priority 4 in the kind of buff cream colored areas are the active farm and forest lands, and the last to be considered. And then another set of criteria about soil classification. And this is the map I think Emily was talking about when she said those colors would change. When we do identify an urban reserve, there will be a priority 1 shown on the map, and that will be urban reserve plus exception areas. Correct? All right. Any questions on that?
Commissioner Baker?
Yeah.
Okay, so here's my question now. What are other lands? Are they lands that just haven't been categorized?
Yeah, they're kind of in-between ones. Some of it's airport reserve, which is not specifically spoken about in the law, so that's just south of the airport. And that's Spencer Butte to the south, I believe. And then there's sand and gravel lands near the confluence of the rivers.
And some circumstances will have changed by the time we do this. I know that Eugene Sand and Gravel submitted testimony for the urban growth boundary that they wanted to have that Goal 5 protection removed from their property. And, you know, if that happens before you look at urban reserves, it won't be other land. It will probably be priority 2 exception land. And we may take a different look at things or another look at things in terms of urban reserves as well. So this is the study that was done for urban growth boundary, but this will not, we will take a new look and create a new map for you to look at for urban reserves.
Mr. Nicolello.
So just a few more questions, sorry. The first is, I didn't get to mention this earlier, but I really liked that little outline of Oregon on the first slide, and I would like that to be a sticker. So I'm just throwing that out there.
That was artwork done at the beginning of Envision Eugene by
That's so
a South Eugene high schooler.
That's amazing, and I would like to campaign for that to be a sticker. So that aside, on a more serious note, the other question I had too, and staff has done so much work on this already, and it so shows, and it's always amazing to see how this gets done despite all the other things you have going on, and I don't know how you do it. But just in terms of like public process, is that something that's been talked about yet? Is that going to wait till the new project manager? I'm sure it's already something you're very aware of and discussing, but
Yeah,
I just
absolutely.
want to touch on that.
You guys are anticipating all of my slides before I get to them, which is great. No, it's fine. It's fine. But I am going to talk about, I think I'll defer my answer until I get to it.
Okay.
Because it's about the next steps.
That's okay.
Okay.
Save time in those meetings.
Cool. Anything else about the categories? Or okay, just a couple more. A little bit more detailed maps here on the same theme that we've collected a lot of information. You might remember these maps. The one on the left shows a closer look at the Clear Lake Road area, and these are development constraints, floodplain and slopes. And then the map on the right shows industrial site constraints. And in this case, it was distance to a freight route and site size. We don't have to get to that level of detail when we're identifying urban reserve land because we aren't specifying it for a particular use such as large lot industrial. But I just wanted to remind you of the level of detail that we do have for all of this land around the UGB. So in addition to gathering a foundation of information about the land, we've talked about this a lot, we're also establishing a growth monitoring program. It's enabled now by policies that we adopted into the comprehensive plan and will be an ongoing program area advised by a committee and with reports that we've been talking about brought regularly to the Planning Commission and the City Council. So that is in process, which brings me to the next steps. So first thing is filling out the project team. I mentioned River Road and growth monitoring as the other major program areas or projects that our team is working on. And Heather is leading the growth monitoring, and Zach is leading River Road. Right now, I'm leading urban reserves, but I really do want some help, and we want to fill out the team with a combination of additional capacity, and those of us who are here in the room who know a lot already will continue to be involved in supporting the work, because that just makes sense. So once we do that, we'll bring to this group a project charter similar to the one that you've seen for River Road that outlines the scope, the tasks, the responsibilities and roles, and all of the elements of process that one might expect. But separate from the project charter is also a public involvement plan. And that's where the commission does have a pretty meaty role in reviewing and actually approving the public involvement plan for the project. So that'll be a next step. And then lastly, we're looking into software tools and things that will help us update the technical analysis that we've already done a lot of work on. And this will, Steve, you'll be excited to know, allow us to plug in, we hope a lot more easily and in a visually compelling way, what happens when we change certain variables. How does that affect the outcomes that we're trying to achieve? And a variety of indicators that we've set up through the growth monitoring program and Envision Eugene. So it is actually really, really exciting. We've seen some demos of what different software programs can do. Envision Tomorrow is one of them. And there'll be lots more to learn about those as we pick one.
Okay. So I have a question. I don't know where it would fit in, but do you know if Springfield is planning on pursuing urban reserves?
I have not heard that they are. They're still seeking acknowledgement of their urban growth boundary and working with the LCD on that. But they're one of our nearby cities, so we'll be coordinating with them and discussing areas that are kind of between our two cities at length.
Okay. Mr. Baker.
Yeah, just kind of follow up on that too. Are there other jurisdictions that have already been through this process or are in process in Oregon, so they've had to work through the statutes and...
Yeah, although oddly, there's a completely separate set of statutes from Metro. Yeah. And then there's another set of statutes that apply when there's the regional planning. And so the Medford area, the regional planning, Metro, there are not a lot of examples of jurisdictions doing it the standard way, which is what we'll do, but enough, and we have a good working relationship with the department that wrote the rules, so we'll continue to talk a lot with them. But not a lot.
Other questions? All right. Thanks for the good work. We look forward to being part of the process and pretty excited about it. Thank you.
Thank you.
All right, we'll move on to the next agenda item. Robin, are you reading that? And again, I'll be leaving in about 5 minutes. So.
5 minutes? Okay. This doesn't have to be a real long agenda item. This is just looking at our committees, liaisons, and project resources. Did everyone get the draft that I sent out last week? Okay, I heard from a couple of you after that. And I think, let's see if I can highlight a couple of things that we need to actually sort through. Commissioner Taylor, you said that you were interested in not being the Sustainability Commission liaison. Commissioner Baker, you said you've been doing it already, so you might as well just keep doing it.
For one more year.
For one more year?
It's a big time, it's a large time commitment, so I'll pass it on to somebody else.
Understood. Understood. And thank you for doing that, by the way. I appreciate the thorough reports as well. So we'll just go ahead and write in Baker for the Sustainability Commission. And you have also been doing Housing Policy Board, is that right?
Yeah, but I haven't been, there's been a lot of conflict, so I think it's probably better if someone has more flexibility in their schedule.
Yeah. Okay.
Those usually, you said it was 8:30 tomorrow morning?
So that's
No, that's
historic.
historic.
Yeah.
It doesn't usually meet on a Tuesday. But, no, the Housing Policy Board meets on a Monday. Usually it's the one Monday that we don't usually meet, but sometimes there is a conflict with our 11. It's 12 to 1:30, and our meeting is at 11:30 then. But now our meetings have changed, but that's the Housing Policy Board and why there's often been a problem with staff, although you've accommodated it by trying to not schedule
Our Mondays.
our Monday, the first Monday of the month, I think is when their meetings are.
Yeah.
So, but if someone has the ability to attend that meeting, it's a lunchtime meeting, 12 to 1:30. It's usually an hour and a half.
Anybody jumping up to grab that one?
I mean, I could staff it. I would put it up to the two commissioners who aren't here.
Yeah.
And if neither one of them do it, I could probably do that.
We have also been attending as staff, as we've been discussing a lot of these housing issues, so if there isn't a commissioner there for any reason, we can just let you know what happened at the meeting.
Okay. And okay, very good. So everything else, I think we'll just, we'll just leave it the way it was in the roster that I sent around, because I didn't get any other objections. The only other thing I think is, Commissioner Taylor, you mentioned that for urban reserve planning, we have Borofsky, Nicolello, and Randall. And if you're all still good with that, that's fine. You mentioned that you would be okay being
You could drop me off that and give it to Kristen.
you want to drop and you want to take that
That's
one?
fine.
Okay.
That way.
So crossing out Borofsky, adding Taylor for urban reserve planning. Thank you. And then the next one is you also mentioned, so for the comprehensive plan phase 2, which is in part dealing with a parcel specific land use diagram, Mr. Taylor, you said you'd also be.
If needed, yeah. Basically, they're just
there's
recognizing that if people are shifting around and want
Yeah.
to shift focus.
So right now we have Commissioner Baker and Commissioner Borofsky on that. You can be on it too if you want to. Or either of you can.
Well, I'll just put out before I leave. I'm fine being shuffled in and out of anyone. The one that I am I think I'm an alternate on it now, but I'm very interested. It's the Growth Monitoring Committee. I think I'm an alternate on that. I would definitely like to be involved with that. If somebody on that one wants one of my other ones, they're more than welcome.
Okay, we should actually sort that out right now, because right now we just have, that's a good point, for the Envision Eugene Technical Advisory Committee for Growth Monitoring. So Borofsky, Jaworski, Nicolello, and Taylor all said you were interested in that one, so we just have to decide. We can't do more than 3. Yes.
I'm happy to rotate off that one, and you can actually, did Commissioner Becker weigh in with any of his interested committees? I'm happy to rotate off any of mine if he's interested in anything, because it is important for commissioners to get integrated into some of those.
Yeah.
So you can count me off that one.
Okay.
And then the only other one that I have been on and would like to continue on is the CDBG, just because I've got a long standing, and I don't even know if that's appointed by us or is it actually, I think it's appointed by the city manager.
Okay.
So.
Yeah, so I think we'll just continue as is.
Okay, and with that, I'm gonna bow out. But again, if you need to shuffle me off any of them, that's fine. If the other people have a more more interest, or some of our other commissioners, I'd be happy to follow up.
Thank you. Yes.
I just wanted to add, I feel the same way that Commissioner Nicolello feels, so I'm actually willing to rotate in or out. I also am open to staff feedback where they think they might need some additional resources or something that a particular commissioner
Perfect.
brings. So just know that I'm flexible.
Okay. So would you like to, do you want to be on the Comprehensive Plan Phase 2 Subcommittee?
Sure.
Okay. So, because we can do up to 3, and
Yeah.
if you want to do that?
Yeah, that's fine.
Okay, cool. It's actually helpful because not everybody can make every subcommittee
Right.
meeting, so it's like, okay. Yep.
And then I'm currently, I think, still the Human Rights Commission liaison, and am often unable to make those meetings. They're Tuesday evenings typically.
Okay.
And so if someone else has an interest,
That's right. Sorry, you did point that out.
That's okay.
That you're, you need to
Yeah.
step off of that one.
well, I would like to. I haven't been
Able to go.
attend
Okay.
for some time. So.
All right, Human Rights Commission. Anyone at the table interested in that? Otherwise, we can put it out.
I can do Human Rights Commission. I'll have some conflicts when I have public hearings in Springfield, but I can otherwise generally make them.
Awesome.
I think until we did our new schedule, they were often on Tuesday nights when we would have public hearings at times. So
Yeah.
there were several conflicts that I had there.
Fabulous. Okay. Yeah, thanks. Thanks for that. I think that pretty much covers.
I was just going to mention that we're probably going to have, just in the scope of things, there's probably a few more meetings that or commissions. You got to tech, some boards that sort of don't exist now, but they'll probably have to be reconstituted or something. So there should be some options for the new commissioner to join some of those as well as some of the existing ones. Very interesting.
Yeah. Well, we can always make accommodations as we go.
But he didn't. The new commissioner didn't suggest anything that he wanted to join.
I have not heard from Commissioner Becker. He suggested that he would like to have the summaries, and so we produced the summaries. I haven't, to my knowledge, heard back from him yet. And I think we had expected him to be here at our meeting today too, so I don't know.
Well, he did mention that he has a lot of conflicts sometimes with
Yeah.
meetings, so that may be part of his limitation.
Yep. Okay. So based on what I've just heard from you guys, what I'll do is kind of make up a final set of assignments and then kick that out. And if there's any problems, we'll just work through it, figure it out.
Okay, thank you, staff. So just as a final note, learning how are we doing? I see maybe one member of the public there. If you have any feedback for us on how we can do better, you're in the hot seat. Great.
Just here to learn.
Just here to learn. Excellent. Well, thank you so much for coming. On that note, without anything else, I'm going to close the meeting. Thank you.
Awesome.